Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to our first class session of the course Journalism Under Siege. I'm Charlie Junkerman, and I'll be your continuing studies host tonight. Do a little bit of introduction and some housekeeping before we get underway. Housekeeping first. I don't want to use up any more of the precious time of our class session tonight, so I'll make this quick. If you have questions about attendance, credit, that sort of thing, class-related questions, you can ask me after class. I'll be around. And also tomorrow, Amy Tolafield from our staff is going to be sending around an email with those sorts of issues. So stand by for the email. Dawn Garcia and Michael Bolton, who are the hosts for the entire sequence of our class sessions, will explain when they get up on stage how the course is going to go, how it's structured. So I'm not going to pretend to do that now, but you'll get it as soon as Dawn comes up and does her introduction of the core of the course. You may notice, although it's unobtrusive, that we're videotaping this course. The Stanford video is in the back. We'll videotape all 5 sessions, and they'll be uploaded to YouTube after the course is finished. Now, one of the consequences of videotaping is that we can't have you ask questions in your own voice without getting a waiver from each one of you who stands up to ask a question, which is impossible. So instead, what we're going to do is that staff from the Knight Fellowships program will be circulating through the audience, yes, during the class session with 3x5 cards and passing them down the rows. So if a question occurs to you, you can write one out and it will get up to stage to the speakers, okay? Sorry for that clunkiness, but it's, what we have to deal with once we start videoing. There will be a 10-minute break after the first hour. So at 8 o'clock, there will be a break. Men's rooms are on this side, women's on that side. And we ask you to try to make your stretch and what you need to do quick so that you can come back and we can get underway again at 8:10. Finally, I'd like to say some thanks to our team, Continuing Studies, who's been working very hard to pull this course together. As Dawn will inevitably tell you, there are 28 guest speakers over the next 5 weeks. I don't think we've ever had a course that's been this rich, this dense, this full, and our staff has been working hard. So sincere thanks to Jack Kirtner, Alex Argyropoulos, Amy Tolafield, Liz Frith, Emma Walker, Hannah Sue, Holly Odofer, and Kylie O'Mara. They're a great team. All right, that's housekeeping. Now, here's a very brief introduction. So welcome to our featured team-taught course this fall, Journalism Under Siege, Truth and Trust in a Time of Turmoil. The genesis of this course is probably not hard for you to imagine. I think we are all aware, in fact, alarmingly aware, that around the world, journalism and press freedom are facing their biggest challenges in decades. Journalists here at home are being accused of being enemies of the people and of reporting fake news. In countries around the world, they are being imprisoned by the thousands and even killed. Given these stark realities, and being convinced of the absolute necessity of a free and honest press to the survival of democracy, Continuing Studies, in collaboration with the John S. Knight Fellowship Program at Stanford, felt that it was our civic duty to convene a forum such as this one, where concerned citizens such as yourselves can learn from professional journalists and engage in conversations that will help all of us understand the challenges that face journalism today. I'm pleased to welcome you tonight and to introduce Dawn Garcia and Michael Bolton, the directors of the course. Dawn Garcia is not just the director of the course, she's the director of the John S. Knight Fellowship Program at Stanford. JSK, as it's familiarly known, began at Stanford in 1966 and has evolved over the years into one of the most prestigious fellowship programs for professional journalists in the world. Every year, JSK brings between 15 and 20 practicing journalists to Stanford, giving them the freedom to take courses, use our libraries, engage with colleagues at research institutes, and charge their batteries to go back out and write engaged and compelling journalism. In our course this quarter, we will hear from 7 current JSK fellows, 2 of them tonight. Dawn began her career as a reporter and editor for the West Coast newspapers, which includes the San Jose Mercury and the San Francisco Chronicle, where she wrote about politics, immigration, and legal affairs. She's the past president of the organization Journalism and Women's Symposium, a national nonprofit organization that supports the professional empowerment and personal growth of women in journalism. She served on nonprofit boards championing First Amendment rights, social justice, and quality journalism, training, and education. She earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Oregon and a Master of Liberal Arts degrees from Stanford. She's taught journalism at Bay Area universities and is currently a lecturer in Stanford's journalism program. She herself was a 1991-92 JSK Fellow, where she studied U.S.-Mexico relations. Her co-director for the course, Michael Bolden, is managing director for communications for the JSK Fellowship Program. Before that, he served for 4 years in the Knight Foundation, and that was after a 13-year stint on the Washington Post, where he led the development and transportation reporting team, and worked as an editor for the Washington Post magazine, Style, and Sunday Arts. He's also worked for the Miami Herald, the Northwest Florida Daily News, and the Times-Picayune from New Orleans. Michael was a fellow in the Maynard Media Academy's Entrepreneurial Leadership Program at Harvard and earned his BA from the University of Alabama. He's a longtime member of the National Association of Black Journalists, the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, the National Press Club, NLGJA, the Association of LGBTQ Journalists, and the Society of Professional Journalists. So, without further ado, please join me in, actually it's just Dawn who's going to be responsible for the first half, so you can welcome Michael at 8:10, but please join me in welcoming Dawn Garcia.
So welcome, good evening. I'm Dawn Garcia, the director of the John S. Knight Journalism Fellowships Program, and I'm really happy to be here with all of you tonight. As Charlie mentioned, around the world, journalism and press freedom issues are facing the biggest challenges in many, many decades. Traditional business models for media are in decline. Journalists are being accused of reporting what's called fake news. And even more serious, some journalists are being imprisoned and others are even being killed. So we have many questions that we're going to talk about in this series here at Stanford. How are journalists and their institutions responding to the perils that they're facing? What effect are these problems having on the profession and on the quality of journalism and the information that the public receives? And what does it mean for democracy? Tonight is the first of 5 evenings that we will spend together in this continuing studies course, which is called Journalism Under Siege, Truth and Trust in a Time of Turmoil. Each of the nights is going to be devoted to issues that are an essential part of our program, the John S. Knight Fellowships Program, and an essential part of journalism. As Charlie mentioned, this is a new collaboration between the Continuing Studies Program and the John S. Knight Journalism Fellowships. I really want to thank Charlie Junkerman for working with us and his talented staff for teaming up to make this program possible. I also want to thank our JSK staff. We have Erica Bartholomew, who's waving there, and Enrico Benjamin here tonight helping us, and they will also be collecting cards for your questions. Final shout out to Michael Bolden, who you'll see, he'll be the host for the second part of this evening. He's our Managing Director for Communications, and he's leading the speaker series with me. The second part, Michael will be leading a conversation of reporters and editors around the world who face threats to journalism on the front lines of journalism. Charlie mentioned our program, which we have 17 outstanding fellows here this year, spending 10 months with us at Stanford. They come here with their families from a number of places, and many of them are here tonight. They're from Akron, Ohio, they're from Oakland, California, New York City, as well as Buenos Aires and Belgium and Botswana. Many of them are here. A few of them will be up on stage the second part of our evening, and they will be featured in other evenings during our course. So the JSK Fellowships program, which started more than 50 years ago here at Stanford, was a sabbatical model for journalists to come and take a break. But journalism is not in the state where journalists can take a break anymore. So the pace of disruptions have inspired us, and the technological change in Silicon Valley and around the world to evolve the program considerably. So these days, fellows do take classes, but they also collaborate with each other and with experts in Silicon Valley and Stanford to find new ways to reinvent and reimagine and transform journalism. For this course, we invited and lined up almost 30 speakers, experts, press experts, journalists, media critics from around the country to engage in lively conversation with you and us and to have enlightening lectures for you. And we really enjoyed putting this course together. A couple things I wanted to mention. The experts are going to be talking about a range of issues, a number of the questions that Charlie mentioned. A couple of them I'll just say tonight. What's the state of press freedom in the United States and abroad? What's happening to the traditional role that journalism has played in a democracy? As technological change accelerates, what's the impact on government and platforms like Facebook and Google, and how the information then flows to all of us in the public? In a time when facts are being called into question, how do we combat the wave of growing misinformation and disinformation? How should journalists cover the growing wave of bias, intolerance, and hate spreading around the globe? And why is there an accelerated decline in the number and strength of local news organizations around the country, including right here in the Bay Area? What does that mean for local communities? And will local news startups fill that void? So those are some of the questions we're going to be talking about over the course of this class. A couple of housekeeping notes. This is about more than 250 of you have signed up. We're thrilled to have you here. We appreciate very much your interest in journalism. There will be time for some questions. If you have a question, just pass a card to the end of the aisle, and Erica or Enrico will pick it up for you. We will try to reserve about 10 minutes at the end for a few questions at the end of each half of the course. The full syllabus for this course is on Canvas, and along with biographical information of the two speakers sitting next to me and the rest of the speakers for the series. There are articles, books, reports, website links for you to learn more, but none of this is required reading, no quizzes. We just hope the material will enlarge your understanding of journalism and give you more information about what's happening today. Each class will be divided into two. Tonight, they're going to be roughly equal. We'll have a break, as Charlie mentioned, at 8 o'clock. And then we could run a little over, heads up, because we'd like to get to your questions. So now we're going to begin. I'm excited to start. Tonight's class is First Draft of History, How a Free Press Protects Freedom. We are looking at how do journalists do their jobs in the face of danger? What happens when they are either imprisoned, sadly killed, or silenced in some way? So the two people we have for this discussion are Brian Caravillano, who's the managing editor of the Associated Press, to my right. He's the #2 executive in the newsroom of the global organization, the Associated Press. He is responsible for the AP's news gathering efforts around the world and in all media formats. And that sounds like not a small job. Previously, he was the AP's managing editor for US News and regional editor in Asia. He helped open bureaus in North Korea, Myanmar, and led coverage of Japan's 2011 earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear crisis. He joined the AP in 2000 as a reporter and editor throughout the United States, including Northern California. He told me he really enjoyed living in Marin. And he was also regional editor for the Southern US. He's a graduate of Colby College. Joel Simon, to my left, is the executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. It's an independent, nonprofit organization to promote press freedom worldwide, and they defend the right of journalists to report the news without fear of reprisal. He's written on press freedom issues for many publications, including Slate, the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, and he's a regular columnist for the Columbia Journalism Review. Prior to joining CPJ in 1997, as America's program coordinator, he worked for a decade as a freelance journalist in Latin America, covering pivotal historical events such as the Guatemalan Civil War, the Zapatista uprising in southern Mexico, economic turmoil in Cuba following the collapse of the Soviet Union. He's a graduate of Amherst College and Stanford University. He has a number of books, and I will, when we get a chance to talk about those after. Please join me in welcoming Brian and Joel to Stanford. So we're going to start with Joel. And we asked each of them to give an overview of their areas of expertise for 5 minutes or so, 5 or 10, and then I'll have some questions, and then we'll open up to your questions.
Well, I'm going to go first, and thank you so much, Dawn, and you left the most important part out of my resume, which is the work that we did together at El Tecolote, which is a community, bilingual community newspaper in San Francisco where I got my start and where I met Dawn. So it's wonderful to be with you and wonderful to be back here at Stanford. I'm going to try and do a sort of history of press freedom in 5 minutes, so this is not going to be easy. But I think that to a certain extent the history of press freedom is a history of CPJ. And I should probably start out by saying something that's frankly I think astounding, which is that if you look at the data, in the last year, so every year CPJ does a census of journalists in prison around the world, and last year there were 262 journalists in prison around the world. That's the highest number we've ever recorded. Wow. CPJ has been around since 1981, and we've been documenting this systematically since 1992. So how is it? Why is it that in this particular moment in time, there are more journalists in prison than at any time in history, in recent history? And I think you have to, again, go back to look at the last 30 years to understand how we got to this point. So when CPJ was created in 1981, we were started by a group of US journalists to defend the rights of journalists working around the world who worked without the protection of the First Amendment, who confronted repression and violence. And the framework around the world for repression at that time was the Cold War. So the two greatest threats to journalism were state censorship that you had in the Soviet Union and in China and in many other parts of the world that was justified based on an ideology that private media didn't represent the kind of perspective of the people, and that the state should control information and impose censorship on all views that were not directed by the state. And then in Latin America, of course, you had violent conflict in the context of the Cold War in which journalists were targeted, and that was a period of massive violence. And then at the end of the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had this period really in the 90s where there was plenty of violence against journalists. You had the conflict in Bosnia, you had the conflict in Algeria in which journalists were targeted, but you didn't have the same levels of state repression. And in fact, you saw an explosion of independent journalism around the world. And journalism is a kind of unique institution because it isn't an institution. It can sort of thrive in periods of transition and chaos. And so as these governments were going through these periods of transition where state power was reduced, you saw a flourishing of independent journalism and the ability of states to control and manage information was more limited. And then if you look at our data again, you look at journalists in prison, you see this trough in the 1990s. And then right around 2000, let me put it this way, at the end of 2000, there were 84 journalists imprisoned around the world. At the end of 2001, there were 112. What happened? You have the onset of the war on terror and a new framework for repression, which is anti-terror. And so you see around the world, governments glommed onto this notion that journalism that reports on groups that the government deems to be terrorist groups is supporting supporting terrorism, aligned with terrorism, and governments repress journalism based on this pretext. And that framework for repression has continued ever since. Then you have, during the same period, you have a global transformation in the information infrastructure because of technology that also unleashed all these powerful forces which also transformed journalism. It had a number of very positive effects, which of course we all recognize and to a certain extent benefit from, which is the ability to access information that was once very limited. Now, of course, we can do that using this technology, but it also sort of ripped apart some of the kind of institutional structures that made journalism powerful. So you saw journalists who were once part of large institutions, now they were often reporting either independently or as freelancers or even on their own using this technology. And they created this kind of new global information infrastructure, a sort of new media ecosystem. And yes, there was a flourishing of information, but the individuals who were out there reporting that information were uniquely vulnerable. And you also saw governments and non-governmental forces that once relied on journalism to get their message out were suddenly less dependent on journalism because they had new ways of disseminating information using this technology. And so you saw an unleashing of violence against journalists and a sudden increase. And you also saw in violent attacks, and you also saw governments recognizing the threat of independent information and cracking down on the internet as itself. And so that was the next framework for repression. And now I think we've entered a new one. And it's really, there are several things that are contributing to this new framework for repression. Some of them are going back at least a decade, which is this new kind of leader, these elected autocrats. I sometimes call them democratators. They're autocratic, but they're elected. So you could look at somebody like Vladimir Putin or Hugo Chavez in Venezuela or Viktor Orban in Hungary. But there's also, you're also seeing, of course, the rise of populist leaders in other parts of the world, including in our own country. And one of the things that we've seen throughout this entire period is that Western democracies have been a bulwark. Of course, their own records haven't been perfect, and they haven't done this systematically, but they've been a bulwark in terms of defending the rights of journalists and press freedom. Of course, in this administration, that's no longer the rubric. And one thing that I'm sure Brian's going to talk about, but I just want to make this last point, which is there's a lot of consternation and concern about the fake news framing in the United States and the negative impact that's having on journalism and the increasing polarization we're seeing here. But from my vantage point, it's actually having an even more deleterious effect around the world because it's providing a new framework for repression. We're seeing governments around the world glom onto this framework once again, call for new fake news laws, denounce critical journalism as fake news. And one of the things we've seen, and I think this is a very important data point, in the year since President Trump has come to power, The number of journalists jailed around the world, or what we have historically called false news charges, has more than doubled. So it was a relatively small number. It was 9 at the end of 2016. It was 21 at the end of 2017. But we're definitely entering a new era in which I think the new framework for repression is the delegitimization of journalism as false news, and a legal framework for repression that basically parallels the kind of rhetoric that we're seeing from the Trump administration.
Wow. Thank you, Joe.
So that's kind of the macro view. I guess I'm going to give a little bit more of the micro view from what things look like inside the AP headquarters newsroom in New York. As Don said, my job is to try to manage the AP's global news report. And as you can imagine, that requires, it's almost a constant barrage these days of safety issues, security issues, standards decisions, consultations with our legal department. It also causes me to spend a lot of time thinking about and focusing on something I never really thought would be part of my job a couple years ago. But you know, we are very focused on, I guess, you know, news literacy, and trying not only to train humans to understand the difference between real news and fake news, but also to train algorithms, which is a whole new field that I, have learned far more about in the past couple years than I ever expected to. Just to look at today, I mean, the AP journalists are covering hundreds of assignments around the world today. I'm just going to give you a few examples that I think are relevant. We have a team on the ground on the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia, where they're covering the aftermath of the devastating earthquake there. Lots of decisions about safety and security and access and all the things that we're focused on here. We have a bureau in Tehran, and they are covering the fallout from an attack by Iran's Revolutionary Guard on militant groups inside Syria. We have journalists who have been out covering major protests in the last few days by Catalan separatists in Spain. And even as we speak, I think it's still going on, we're at a Trump rally in South Haven, Mississippi. And I mention that in part because I think a few years ago it would have seemed very incongruous to mention a US example on a list of things like that. But I think we are all well aware of how the climate toward journalists and journalism have changed in this country, and the challenges that presents. It's definitely a thing that some of the same precautions and concerns that journalists overseas have long faced are now being talked about and have become concerns in US newsrooms. So we can talk about a little bit more about that later. But working for the AP in particular, it's very hard to not be very aware of and concerned about the safety of journalists and about journalism access. We are a nonpartisan news organization that takes position on nothing other than issues of press freedom and access and journalist safety. This is the one thing for which we feel it is right for us to be advocates and activists even, and on nothing else. If you ever come to visit the AP headquarters in Lower Manhattan and you walk into our newsroom, and anyone is welcome to do so anytime you're in New York, one of the first things that you see is what we call the Wall of Honor. And the Wall of Honor is a memorial that contains the names of 35 AP journalists who have been killed while reporting the news. And the oldest of these was from 1876, when a guy named Mark Kellogg was killed beside General Custer covering the Battle of Little Bighorn. The most recent ones are from 2014, which was actually an especially bad year. The AP lost 4 journalists in 2014 and several others who were seriously wounded. And if you look at that wall, and I think this is generally true around the world, visual journalists are disproportionately represented because you have to be there with your camera to document a disaster, a conflict, or a protest. And as a reporter, it's always better to lay eyes on the things that you're writing about. There's no question about that, but it is possible to do that without running into live fire. It's not really possible for visual journalists to do that. And so if you look at that wall, or if you look at the rosters of journalists who've been killed over the years, photographers and video journalists are represented there in disproportionate numbers. In 2015, our CEO, Gary Pruitt, publicly called for the killing or hostage-taking of journalists to be considered a war crime under international law. And here's something that Gary said in a speech then at the Foreign Correspondents Club in Hong Kong. It used to be that when media wore press emblazoned on their vest, it gave them a degree of protection. That labeling now is more likely to make them a target. At the time that he was saying this, it was, as you'll all recall, when the Islamic State was capturing, kidnapping, and sometimes beheading journalists that it had taken hostage in Syria and Iraq. So that was a particularly dark time. But for all the reasons that Joel's been talking about, it's pretty hard to argue that in the years since, the climate for doing journalism around the world has gotten a whole lot better. The public derision of journalists at press conferences and rallies, the whole enemy of the people thing, the dismissal of real facts as fake news, and it's absolutely true that this has not only helped really bring about a decline in the public's trust and faith in reported facts, but it has emboldened other leaders, from Viktor Orban and Erdogan to even Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar, to kind of take a page out of that book and to use it as a way to sometimes imprison, but certainly repress journalists. And for the longest time, for all of our lifetimes, the US has always been a beacon for free press and has had, I think you could say, sort of the moral high ground on that front. What the future holds, we don't know, but certainly if you're Erdogan in Turkey sitting there looking at the United States right now, it no longer looks like such a beacon, and you might feel emboldened to do things to journalists in your country that you might not have a few years ago when you're trying to gain access to the European Union and that sort of thing. This is also true in small town America and in congressional races across the country. People feel emboldened to say and do things to journalists that they may not have a few years ago. On Friday, I attended an event that Joel's team at CPJ put on, along with Reuters, which is fighting for the release of two of its reporters, Wa Lone and Cha So-u. And they hosted a gathering during the General Assembly at the UN in support of these and other journalists around the world who have been imprisoned. These two were convicted of trumped-up charges and sentenced to years of hard labor. And I have my journalism is not a crime button on from that event. Thought it would be appropriate.
Sell those, we could get us something going here.
But I also want to highlight that there are unprecedented numbers of journalists who have been kidnapped and imprisoned. We have seen a lot of journalists killed over the years. For every one of those, there are a lot of near misses. And I wanted to focus on that a little bit. I'll give you a few examples from my own world. My own colleague in Myanmar, Esther Tucson, who was actually the first Burmese journalist ever to win a Pulitzer Prize, had to flee her home country around the same time that Wa Lone and Cha So-u had been arrested. And she has not been home in more than a year, I think, or close to a year. And I think she considers herself the lucky one compared to what's happened to them, but she had people following her home at night. She was getting threatening phone calls. It just got to the point where it no longer seemed safe for her to be there. We have had, just in the past couple weeks, to evacuate journalists from Yemen and Bangladesh because of threats and or attacks on them. But they got out and they're alive and they're now safe. One is in Cairo, one is in Delhi. And I have lots of other examples like this, and I'm not going to belabor this point, but these are journalists who work for a large news organization. The AP, while not endlessly resourced, has the resources to act when there is a threat against one of its journalists if we have enough advance warning. We have a global director of security who happens to be a former deputy director of the Secret Service. We have regional security specialists around the world who work closely with our journalists. They assess the situation on the ground before we send people into a dangerous situation. We have flak jackets and helmets that we can give them when they need them. And we've had to deploy those in the United States in the last few years to cover riots and other things, more than we have in the past. We have a legal department that is outstanding and they can fight for them. And we also have a really big platform, a huge global audience from which we can advocate for their safety and security. And this is something Joel and I were talking about earlier that Reuters has done a fantastic job of in highlighting what's happened to these two journalists in Myanmar. But what we should worry about the most is the freelancers who don't have this kind of apparatus behind them and who are often younger and sometimes less experienced and don't have necessarily the resources to get out of a country or to avoid getting into the kinds of situations. Part of this has to do with the financial challenges that nearly all news organizations face. There just aren't as many job opportunities for people coming out of journalism school or who want to get into journalism. That has led people to take risks that they may not have taken a generation ago. But when the public is of the opinion that news should be free or should come at very little cost, where is the money going to come from to invest in things like journalist safety and access and all of the things that we need to fight for to ensure a free press around the world? So that's certainly a problem that we can talk about a little bit more. I think I'll leave it at that. I also want to say that I am a rarity, I think, in this business because I'm a lifelong optimist. And I was trying to think of some positive note to end on here in my opening statement, and I actually don't have one. These are tough times, you know, and I'm encouraged by events like the CPJ one at the UN on Friday. I'm encouraged that we're here talking about these things tonight because these are topics, things like safety and access and news literacy, where we as journalists, as I said earlier, we shy away from advocacy, but this is an area where we need to put up a fight. We need to get out of our sort of defensive position, and we need to see this as an area where it's okay to be an activist. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. I wanted, just following up on that, I wanted to talk to you and ask you about that. Do you think the public understands where the United States, where especially U.S. journalism is in regards to things like press freedom? The World Press Freedom Index puts the United States at 45 out of 180 countries on the index. So that's right, there are 44 countries, including South Africa, Jamaica, Ghana, a number of countries that are judged by the Reporters Without Borders to have a lot more press freedom than the United States, where we have, it's enshrined in our important document that that the press has the right to do what they do for the good of the public. What do you think? Do you think people understand that where the United States falls in that? Do you think it's?
I'm not sure there's one answer to that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it has so much to do with where people live, what their what their access is to good information. I mean, the decline of a lot of local news organizations have had a negative effect on this, I think, in a lot of parts of the country. I mean, maybe here's where my optimistic take can come in. I mean, we hear, I seem to be the guy that gets all the hate mail at the AP, and it stacks up on my desk. I also get a tremendous amount of encouragement and attaboy type stuff from people. So I think there is kind of an upwelling. It feels to me like, and I have no science or data or polling to back this up, it feels to me like there's an upwelling of awareness about press freedom issues, and that something that we have taken for granted in this country for generations actually is worth paying some attention to. But I think there's a lot of data that shows that faith in media and in journalism is at an all-time low. And so, that shows a different kind of awareness.
Right.
And I think that's something that we should be very, very concerned about.
I was going to ask you, Joel, one of the, on your list this year, the CPJ list of journalists who have been killed, there have been 43 journalists killed so far this year in 2018. I happen to know two of them. One overseas, one U.S. Just quickly wanted to talk about those two cases and then ask you a bit about what's going on there. Shujat Bahari, who was the editor of the Rising Kashmir newspaper in Kashmir, I met at a global editors conference in Lisbon on June 1st, and we had a good discussion. He was curious about our fellowship, thought about applying, sent me an email when we all got back on June 5th saying, this year I think I'll try my luck. You inspired me, let's talk some more. June 14th, as he stepped out of his office in Kashmir, he was shot. And he'd been given police protection because of earlier attacks on him in 2000. This time his two security officers were also killed and disappeared. He was talked about as a voice of moderation, a courageous, big-hearted editor by the Editors Guild of India. And they said it's a new low and a rapidly deteriorating environment for media practitioners in Kashmir and in the country in general. So what's going on in Kashmir that he would be a target?
Well, actually, one of our Asian researcher was just in Kashmir and is looking into his killing, and I'm sorry to say that we really don't know who was behind it, and exactly what their motivation is, and there doesn't seem to be much of an investigation at all, which is hardly surprising. There is some sort of talk that maybe there were militants, and exactly why he was targeted is not clear. We have had a lot of incidents recently in Kashmir. The conflict there, as you know, sort of ebbs and flows, and right now it's not in the sort of global spotlight, but the reality is that conditions for journalists there continue to be extremely difficult. And I will say more broadly about India, I mean, there's a certain amount of attention on the fact that the Indian media, the Indian media based in the major cities in Delhi and Mumbai has grown tremendously as the Indian economy has grown and as literacy has increased. But the reality is that outside of major cities, violence against journalists is endemic, and that investigations are rare, justice is rare. And that you also, the Modi government has also adopted a very, hostile and aggressive posture towards the media. So, there's some positive developments in India, but the overall picture is difficult.
The second person, just to pick out a few examples, was not Kashmir or Afghanistan, but a U.S. newsroom which was 30 miles from our nation's capital. Rob Hyacin had been here at Stanford in 2003-04. He was a JSK fellow in our program and an editor at that time, a reporter at that time, a writer at the Baltimore Sun. He was, I would call him a gentle giant. He was a 6'5", an endearing storyteller and a generous mentor. And on June 28th, the same month that the editor from Kashmir was killed, 11 people were in the Capital Gazette newsroom in Annapolis that day. 5 of the 11 were killed, including Rob. And it was his wife's birthday. They had planned to celebrate when he got home, and he never made it home. Why are U.S. journalists being targeted? And that was obviously, we haven't had many killings in U.S. newsrooms. But there's been some discussion on whether was it a person who was just angry at the newsroom, or was he emboldened in some way by the current climate?
Well, let me say a couple things about that. First, Dawn, I'm really sorry that that you experienced that, and it's very painful, and it's something I identify with because a lot of journalists who I meet. Who come to, who I interact with in my role in CPJ are the journalists who are most at risk. Right. And sometimes, it's just a matter of time. Yeah. They're so, and I'm horrified and outraged, but honestly, I'm often inspired by them because these are journalists, and I'll mention one that, is kind of a recent painful incident with Javier Valdez, who was a very well-known journalist in Mexico, lived in Sinaloa and Culiacan, covered the drug beat there. He was a close friend of our organization of CPJ. He knew that he was threatened. We actually tried to work to help him evacuate, and he just insisted that he had to stay and cover the story. So when these things happen, that's the one thing that consoles me. Is that it's astounding to think that a profession that is so vilified and denigrated and attacked and undermined by our political leaders and this current environment and political leaders around the world, that there are journalists who believe so deeply in this work and this calling that they're willing to give their life. And I do want to say just a couple things about what happened at the Capital Gazette. I think that one of the things that I talked about in the aftermath of that killing was just that I went back into our data and I looked at who are the journalists who are at risk, and yes, you mentioned visual journalists, and that's one category. Another category is local journalists. I mean, I don't think people understand how intimate it is to be a journalist in a local community. So you're covering the community. You're not anonymous. You run into these people at the grocery store. In every town, whether it's some radio station in the Philippines or some local newspaper in Vermont, there is somebody who's got some terrible grudge against you, and is angry and feels that they're not treated fairly. And you mix that with, availability of guns, and I'm not just talking about this country, but in many places around the world, it's easy to obtain weapons, and you have a pretty toxic environment. And I mean, there are incidents where it seems that Trump's rhetoric was adopted by people who threaten newsrooms. This does not seem to be the case in the Capitol Gazette. This was somebody with a long-standing grievance. But one thing that is important to note, and this is somewhat anomalous without question, but I think it's a wake-up call. So the 3 most deadly countries in the world for journalists this year are Afghanistan, number 1, Syria, number 2, United States, number 3.
Let's let that sit for a minute.
Yeah.
Wow. So one of the things, thinking, Brian, we talked a little bit earlier about all the things the AP is doing to protect its journalists around the world. And you mentioned, flak jackets and training and all the things that I think had been done a little, but were done a lot more now. What is the AP doing to protect its reporters who are out covering the U.S. political scene, where now reporters are seen as the enemy of the people? And there have been some pretty tense moments in the pens there as they're covering rallies and other protests.
Yeah, I think, at this point, we're lucky that it's been mostly tense moments. I think a lot of people have seen the video of particularly Jim Acosta from CNN being screamed at rallies. And even going back to the 2016 election, journalists were sort of kept in pens at a lot of these rallies, and became kind of an object of derision, not just from candidates, but also from people who were in the. And it's required a level of awareness and training among people who cover beats that never really seemed like very dangerous beats in the past, right? And I think compared to a lot of the things that we're talking about in places like Bangladesh or Yemen, it's not the same, but it's something I think we didn't think that we'd be seeing in this country at this point in history, and it's been really eye-opening. And as the day after the midterm elections, the 2020 presidential election is going to begin, and there are going to be a lot of candidates. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of news organizations are going to approach their coverage with much more of a mindful eye about safety and security. You're going to have a lot of organizations providing training and guidance to political reporters that looks a lot more like what war reporters might have gone through a generation ago. And I don't know what that says about the climate in this country, but it's I didn't see it coming. I'm not sure anyone else did either.
Right, exactly. Was there anything from what you talked about that you wanted to add to? We just have a couple more minutes, either one of you, and then we'll open it up to questions.
One thing I want to sort of just add to what Brian was talking about. We just had a conversation today, earlier this morning. I can't believe it was today, but I was in New York earlier this morning. We had a meeting at it was 8 o'clock, and we brought in a bunch of journalists. We had a little panel discussion about threats against journalists in the United States, and we're trying to think whether CPJ as an organization, it's time for us to really engage with those threats and kind of raise an alarm. Journalists, if you go into this profession, you understand that people are going to be angry with you, and you have to have a bit of a thick skin. There's no question that's a job requirement. If you're doing a good job, you're going to piss people off at some point. But I think what's different. One is the kind of people are just unleashed online. And the level of vitriol, and it's particularly targeting women. That experience of reporting well female and having to confront that level of hostility and vile language. There's a question whether that speech is inhibiting other people's speech and whether that's an issue for us. And the other thing that we've seen in our data, which is that, that language which people encounter online, when you're out there as a journalist covering a demonstration, or you're sort of doing street reporting, and there's an incident that you come into contact with the public. That same anger is sometimes expressed directly to your face. And so we've seen, we have this website we've created called the US Press Freedom Tracker, and we're tracking these incidents in the United States, and I was shocked. We don't have a baseline, so we don't know if this number is higher than what we've seen in previous years, but in the last year and a half, there have been 75 violent incidents against journalists in the United States. So that's I think there's, you put that together with the Capitol Gazette shooting.
Yeah.
You put that together with some of the concerns on the legal front, and I think we're living through a very dangerous moment, and I think it has repercussions for journalists in this country, and it also has a ripple effect, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, around the world.
Right.
I have two quick stories. One is that day that the Capitol Gazette shooting. Lately, there have been so many days where you're watching things unfold and you're thinking to yourself, like, people are going to learn about this in history books. This is a moment where you really want to pay attention. I will never forget that day because the tone in the newsroom was different than on any other day I can remember. And and we're in New York City. We're far from where this thing is happening, but there's people in the room who knew people who worked there, and who knew Rob Hyacin, and people are incredibly professional, and they do their jobs, and they go about it, but that day it just felt so different. And part of it was just sort of waiting, like, is this, what happened here? Like, was this some personal grudge, what it turned out to be, or was there some larger political motive here? That day, I walked out of the office, and NYPD was posted outside of AP headquarters. And across the street from us is what was Time Inc. and is now Meredith, and there were police patrol there. And, and they were outside WNYC, and they were outside the New York Times building. And the NYPD had sort of taken it upon itself to provide an added layer of security at news organizations that day, just in case this turned out to be some sort of larger thing.
Right.
Yeah, and it was like the sort of thing that just made you want to cry. The other, though, is, the whole thing about people just doing their jobs. I mean, amid all of this, the most important thing we can do is just do our jobs, right? I mean, if you keep doing what you do and reporting the news in ways that are credible and accurate and defensible and all of that, you sort of have to have some faith that will eventually carry the day. I have a really wonderful colleague who's based in Kentucky named Claire Galafaro, and she covers for us Appalachia, and she covers a lot of communities of people who are really having a hard time. And those people don't see a lot of reporters for national news organizations come by and hang out at their barbershop or their cafe or whatever and talk to them. And she had this story that she told me one time, which was she was interviewing this guy who's going on and on about the media this and the media that, and the mainstream media doesn't get it, and I don't pay any attention to that. And she kind of interrupted him and said, well, I work for the AP, which is about as mainstream as you can possibly get. And he said, well, you seem nice. So, to me, that gets to the importance of, you've got to get out there and talk to people and engage with them, right? I mean, if you can, it's sort of the, think globally, act locally cliche applies, I think, in that as journalists, our individual interactions with the people that we talk to and that we cover still really count. Not everything needs to be delivered, on massive scale, but individual conversations with people really count. And it's really important to me as an editor that we are out in those communities talking to people as much as we possibly can. I mean, last Thursday, the day of the Senate Judiciary Committee, was another one of those days where I'm thinking, this is something my grandchildren will be learning about in school. We had several dozen people out in communities all across the country just talking to men and women of all races and ethnicities and political, it's not polling, it's not scientific, but it's really important to get the voices of people into your journalism and to have that kind of interaction with people, and hopefully that over time has some kind of an impact.
Great. Thank you. We're going to go to questions. Michael's got a few for me. Excuse me. Thanks. So the first question, do you think that U.S. journalists have shown sufficient solidarity with one another when a colleague has been harassed or shut down at a press conference by the president or other government officials?
Well, I mean, I'll take that one. I mean, the first thing I'd say is, in normal times, the U.S. media or the U.S. public is well served by a hyper-competitive media. You know, it's really hard to get I mean, I do this for a living, so I know how hard it is. It's hard to get journalists to kind of unite forces. The threat has to be really pronounced. So at first I sort of thought, okay, you want journalists who are, you have to understand, we see that take place in the White House briefing room, and that's essentially a show. There's not a heck of a lot of news that gets made there. There's a lot of grandstanding. There's a lot of dysfunction that we all observe. But the basic notion that it should be difficult to get journalists to kind of come together, I think is correct. But the time has come. The time has come. We just can't pretend anymore that this is business as usual. And there's been a little bit of that. There's been Fox News has complained when a CNN reporter who was part of the pool was denied access. That we need to see that kind of thing.
That's pretty exceptional.
It's exceptional, and we need to see that sort of thing. Where there is a lot of cooperation among media organizations is through the work that we do, where it's real risk of physical danger, and you're talking about overseas deployments and threats to journalists deployed in high-risk environments. There's a lot of information sharing, a lot of solidarity, a lot of the AP sticking up for Reuters and Reuters sticking up for AP. But I think the fact that it's difficult to get the U.S. media to come together is actually a good thing. But I think the alarm should have gone off by now.
Okay.
I think, we spent a lot of time talking about safety, and another huge issue that we spend a lot of time on is access. And then this is an area in which news organizations traditionally do join forces because there's strength in numbers, and that might be filing lawsuits over getting access to documents through FOIA, or when people get shut out of press conferences and stuff like that. I think on access issues, there has been a lot of coalition building historically, and I think that's something that we can kind of build on.
We all know a lot about what Trump has done for press freedom. I'm not sure I do. But how did the George Bush and Obama administrations contribute to the decline in press freedom?
Oh, can I?
Yeah, you go first, and I'll have that.
We are, we are, I don't know, 20 years into a steady decline in terms of the public's access, particularly to the White House, that began really with the Clinton administration and then the Bush administration. Not that long ago, our executive editor, Sally Busby, and me were going to conferences saying the Obama administration is the most media-unfriendly administration in U.S. history, and they conducted more leaks investigations and put more journalists under subpoena than any previous administration. Oddly, the access to the Trump administration is actually better than access to the Obama administration. Journalists have more access to the president and the people around the president now than they did certainly during the second term of Obama. But that is obviously countered by all of the rhetoric about enemies of the people and fake news. It's just different, but it's part of a continuum. It's not something that just started 2 years ago. It's something that's been in steady decline for a long time, and I think it's important to remember that.
Yeah, we did a big report called the Obama Administration in the Press in 2013, written by Len Downey Jr., the former executive editor of the Washington Post, that chronicled the Obama administration's aggressive leak investigations, including its use of the Espionage Act, this 1917 that basically criminalizes publication of, or could be used to criminalize publication of confidential information, and also a lot of the people that were interviewed for that report described the Obama administration, and Obama in particular, as sort of a control freak who had amazing. The thing about covering the Obama administration during that period is he was a very effective manager, and he hated leaks. And he did a pretty good job of stamping them out and investigating people within his administration who leaked. And he also understood the new dynamics of the media, and he did a lot of end runs around the media. So if he wanted to, talk to a specific audience, he might forego a media interview and do, Between Two Ferns, or go on,
Right.
go on Jon Stewart or something. And so this drove journalists absolutely around the bend. Let's keep something in mind about Trump. Yes, he attacks the media all the time. People don't like that. But his administration leaks like a sieve. Everyone is talking to everyone. There's plenty of access. And he does nothing but watch television all day long. He's obsessed with the media. So like journalists under Obama felt slightly irrelevant. And under Trump, they don't like being called the enemies of the people. They don't like being screamed at. But Trump is obsessed with traditional media coverage. At least they feel relevant.
Yeah, I mean, let's not forget the Obama Justice Department wiretapped the AP and didn't tell us about it until after they had already gotten the results they wanted out of that, and they used it to flush out a leaker who's now in jail.
Great.
So,
Great. I have time for one quick one. What is the obligation of news organizations to protect freelancers, moral/ethical, if not legal?
Well, I'll take that one first. I mean, I think that I want to go back to a point I made at the beginning, which is about what I call, the information ecosystem or the media ecosystem. So we no longer live in a period in which, information and news organizations are hierarchical, where you have like your editors and you have your correspondents deployed and everything filters up. The information networks that allow us to be informed are very horizontal, and they include freelancers, and people are very focused on that. But I would then talk about the next step, which is when you're talking about it from the perspective of people in this room or an international news organization, local journalists. If you are working in, whether you're working in Myanmar or you're working in, in Mexico or you're working in Nigeria, and the information that you're have access to that you report for a global audience comes from the local press. So they're part of that information ecosystem. And so are, because of technology, what you might call eyewitnesses who document and record what they see and share that information via social media. That makes it into this information stream. I think, certainly from my perspective, that we should have the broadest possible vision of all of these people who are contributing to our global understanding and have a robust framework for defending all of their rights. I think it's absolutely essential to see ourselves as journalists as part of a much broader network of people who gather and disseminate information to the public.
yeah, we don't really differentiate. I mean, we work with freelancers all around the world, and if you're working for us and a story that you write or shoot gets you into a lot of trouble in your home country, we feel we have an obligation to protect you, no different than if you're an employee, a full-time employee of the AP. There's a whole nother realm here that I think is it's really a burgeoning issue for a lot of news organizations, which is that there are parts of the world in which our view isn't professional journalists or freelancers. It's people. A lot of what we have seen out of Syria over the last few years is user-generated content.
Yeah.
And it's certainly possible that someone who shoots a piece of video or takes a picture that ends up getting published around the world by the AP or Reuters, the New York Times, might put themselves at risk by doing that. And it's very much got to be part of the conversation. Not only, did you take this and, are you willing to, do you understand all the rights, the copyrights and the implications of distribution, but are you in a place now where you're safe so when this gets published that you're not going to suffer some repercussion for it? And I think this is something a lot of news organizations are struggling with, even beyond the freelancer question, is what is your obligation to the safety of people who provide you with user-generated content that you might not be paying for at all?
Well, let's give a round of applause to our speakers, Joel Sayan, Brian Caravelano. And we're going to take a 10-minute quick break.
Okay, so welcome back. Everyone can hear me now? Great. So just a couple of additional housekeeping things now that we're back. If you ran out of cards or you don't have an index card and you still might like to ask a question, just raise your hand and Erica will ensure you get a card so that you can ask your question. If you posed a question for the first panel and we didn't get to it, we are saving some of those questions. Each of our nights throughout October are themed, and some of the questions fit better with some of the other discussions we're going to have. So we hope to get to as many of those as we possibly can. But now that we've heard from two executives who are at the forefront of protecting press freedom here in the United States and around the world, let's hear from some of the people who are actually on the ground. Our next panel will introduce you to some of the journalists who are taking the risks, both legal and physical, to help bring important stories into the light. Please join me in welcoming, on my far right, Roman Anen. Roman is a member of the JSK Fellowships class of 2019. He is head of the investigative section of Moscow-based Novaya Gazeta, one of the most famous Russian newspapers in the world. His projects have revealed corruption in the military, politics, and business, including in construction contracts for the 2014 Winter Olympics. He was a member of the Panama Papers investigative team, which delved deeply into the financial dealings of offshore entities, political leaders, corporations, and business people. That investigation received the Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting in 2017. To my immediate right is Joel Konopal. Joel, as well, is a member of the JSK Fellowships class of 2019. He is an investigative journalist and managing partner of the Inc. Center for Investigative Journalism, a nonprofit newsroom in Gaborone, Botswana. Prior to establishing Inc., Joel was the editor of the Botswana Guardian newspaper, and he also was part of the Panama Papers investigation. To my immediate left, Alejandra Zanek van Bertrop is an independent investigative journalist in Mexico. She has covered issues related to drug trafficking, state corruption, political assassinations, and human rights. She has worked in a range of Mexican media, and in 2013, she won the Pulitzer Prize for investigative journalism for her work with New York Times reporter David Barstow on the use of multi-million-dollar bribes by Walmart in Mexico. And on my far left is H.R. Venkatesh. Venkatesh is a member of the JSK Fellowships class of 2019. He has more than 16 years of experience as a journalist. He's worked on countering disinformation and bias and has worked to reinvent coverage of critical health and developmental issues. In 2015, he was the editor at The Quint, and before that, director of communications at Change.org in India. He was also a senior anchor at CNN IBN for 9 years. He's also the founder of Netadata, a journalism project that seeks to bridge divides by creating safe spaces for debate. So, we're here to hear from these journalists who are on the front lines. Let's dive right in. My first question is for Roman. Roman, according to CPJ, 58 journalists have been killed in Russia since 1992. At least 5 journalists at your news organization have been murdered since 2000. Have you ever been personally threatened, and what steps have you taken to protect yourself and your loved ones?
Yeah, so I would like to start with my brave colleagues, and I knew some of them who were killed. There were no 5, but 4 members of the staff and 2 people who worked closely with us. And I think it's important to know their names. My section is named under the name of Yuri Shikochikhin. He is considered to be the father of investigative reporting in Russia, actually. And he was poisoned by, as we believe, secret services in Russia, because he reported a lot about corruption within the secret services. Then we had Igor Domnikov. He reported a lot about regional authorities, and he was killed by a very cruel organized gang. Then we had Anna Politkovskaya. She reported about Northern Caucasus, and she was shot down in her near her apartment. And 2 people were shot down also in the streets in the center of Moscow. They reported about neo-Nazis. And then we had Natalia Stemirova. She also was killed for covering Northern Caucasus. So you see that the topics are quite different, and people can do anything, but still, something can happen to them. But still I want to be, frankly, the situation is changing today. It's changing to the better, because the last attack on journalists in Moscow was a number of years ago. Oleg Kashin was beaten. And I'm talking now about national reporters, because in the regions, the situation is worse, but there is no any journalism. So the journalism in the Russian regions is dead, almost dead. And that is why, there is nothing even to say what's going on there. I faced threats a number of times, but I didn't consider them. I mean, twice we thought that they were serious, and there is only one recipe. In this case, you just leave the country immediately. So, don't want to exaggerate the problem which is in Russia, because many people think that this is like a war zone. It's not. I mean, it's still not a bad place for reporters. At least, I mean, many topics to cover when the state is corrupt. So, yeah, I mean, people from Sweden envy me, because there is nothing to cover in Sweden, while in Russia there is plenty of job. So for my 10 years of investigative reporting, I had to leave the country only twice, which is, I think, is not a kind of bad percentage.
Okay, thank you. So, and sort of naturally following it, let me turn to you, Zanik. Just less than 2 weeks ago, journalist Mario Leonel Gomez Sanchez was gunned down outside his home in Mexico. What steps do you take to protect yourself from physical threats?
I think, I take I'm basically very cautious. It's not like I feel under threat continuously. It's that when we work on difficult or tough stories, we do sort of higher the alert and become more careful. And being careful includes really just basic stuff like being very careful with your cell phone, with not having any important information or contact information in our cell phones that could put some other people or our sources at risk if somebody got to our cell phone, or being very careful with the computer and the information on the computer so as nobody can access to information that could put others at risk. And just basically walking carefully and looking to the sides. But I may not be the best case because I work in Mexico City, and although covering Mexico City has also become difficult, now that we're starting to cover drug cartels working in Mexico City, which was for many years like an isle, like the protected part of the country. This used to be a haven for reporters, and we pretty much work in safer conditions than reporters are that are covering local politics, because from what we know and the studies made so far, most of the threats and most of the attacks on reporters occur or come from the politicians who are involved with the cartels or the organized crime. So basically, but what I do see is I have colleagues who work in different parts of the country who have to work under the protection or so-called protection of police. So you have a reporter covering, imagine whichever story, going on a car with 3 huge bodyguards, armed bodyguards, and reporters who have to live with, a huge chain of locks on their doors that you can hardly believe anybody can live behind. So the lives of many have been affected. Many reporters have been affected. The chances that they do in a very good and solid investigative work can be affected, also because of that protection structure that has come about when there's a reporter at risk. So that's the mechanism the government has come up to. When a reporter is at risk, they come up with these protection strategies, which we don't know if they protect them or we just cripple journalism as well.
Okay, thank you. So continuing this sobering thread, Venkatesh, 48 journalists have been killed in India since 1992, 3 this year. And you've worked as a television journalist, you've worked as an online journalist, you have a broad view of the media landscape. Picking up on this thread from Zanik, is it more dangerous for journalists in cities such as Delhi or Bangalore, or is this a problem in other areas? Are the dangers more physical or legal? Give us the overview.
Yeah, I will say that threats against journalists in India, they fall under 2 broad categories: the acute threats and then chronic threats. And so acute threats are, you can't make generalizations saying urban areas are more dangerous or rural areas are more dangerous because of the people we've seen killed in the recent past in India. One was in Bangalore, and she was gunned down in front of a house in a very well-lit colony in a safe neighborhood. And then
This was the death
this was
a
Gauri
year ago?
Lankesh, yes. And then Shujat Bukhari, who was killed in Kashmir. But the thing is, I would say that journalists in non-urban areas are under more threat, and I want to link that to the chronic threat. So the chronic threat is more low-key, but it's no less pernicious. For example, I would say that there are, again, under this chronic bucket, there are three broad threats. One is, 30% of all advertising revenue for most newspapers in India comes from the government. And when it comes from the government, it's not very difficult for governments to put journalists under pressure, and it leads to self-censorship. The second is, there is a saying in India that journalists were only asked to bend, but they crawled. So what happens is, in a scenario where in theory you have press freedom, the Indian Constitution guarantees press freedom, but because of government censorship and other forms of censorship, there is this tendency among journalists to not stick their necks out, which I think is pernicious, and because it comes amid a culture of fear. And India is, I think, 138 in the World Press Freedom Index, and geography and demography also plays a big role. For example, it's not easy for an Indian journalist in, let's say, Bangalore to help the Indian journalist in another part of the country because they're divided by language. There are 22 official languages, and they're also divided by geography, and the terrain is different, and the literacy levels are different. So the challenges just to uphold press freedom are many, and so acute and chronic both are problems.
Yeah. Okay. So Joel, now in Botswana, CPJ report there haven't been any journalists killed in recent years. However, there are substantial legal threats. Give us an understanding of what the media landscape is like in Botswana and some of the challenges of working there as an investigative journalist.
Yeah, basically, the situation is almost similar to what Venkatesh explained as the chronic example, in which we have a very litigious political aristocracy. The president, at least until April he left office, he had actually said he does not read, he has got no respect for private press, especially the critical press. The judiciary holds itself to be so subservient to government. Most of the litigation newspapers or private media loses the cases most of the time. And this creates a culture of self-censorship. And because the government is the main also provider of, I think it's 70% provider of advertising, it creates, government chooses to actually decide who to advertise with, and it creates direct starvation of the media. Then again, there'll be self-censorship because most of the media houses wants to survive.
So, to follow up on that, how have you, being managing director of an investigative journalism center, how do you deal with that threat? I mean, how do you and your organization resist such government pressure?
The advantage is that we don't rely on government for funding. At least we rely on George Soros and other funders. So we are kind of insulated, at least at the level of funding. So we don't need to get funding from government. But the biggest challenge happens to be surveillance on investigative journalists, tapping of phones, break-ins, and we do very little, the best that we can, including trying to protect our hardware and software and really trying to provide physical security into our residences and always checking your shoulder if somebody is following you and things like that. But we are lucky we have partners around the world. We have OCCRP in Romania, which helps us with technical support. We have ICIJ in Washington,
And what is ICIJ?
Oh, the International Consortium for Investigative Journalists based in Washington that has been doing the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers and other major leaks. Normally when we are under threat, they are able, because they have the platforms, to amplify the concerns, and we tend to see a reduced level of threats normally.
Okay. Picking up on something that you mentioned, just this week, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Joel's organization, issued an advisory for journalists in more than 40 countries in terms of their security, especially on mobile devices, because of the proliferation of spyware which could be used to monitor their movements. So all of you work in environments where the potential for being spied on by government or other actors is there. How do you protect yourself? Let's start with Roman. What do you do in terms of security for your devices and for this, what you're working on?
Well, you know, the first rule about security is never talk about security if you want to be secure, right? So why would you tell, you know, people what you use? But let's assume, you know, that there is a lot of open source apps, which of course I don't use, but you know, they might work for you. I don't know. I mean, you know, like Signal is a very good app for messaging and for calling. So it provides encrypted phone calls. Of course, I mean, there are some other. I mean, it depends on what kind of job you do. So let's say there is Signal is good, but you know it's bad because it still demands you to connect with your phone number. And say if our reporters work in Chechnya, even the fact that they have a number of somebody from Chechnya will become very dangerous for that person, which means that we need an app which allows you to connect, to create an account without the mobile number, and such apps exist as well. And I will not tell you their names, but you know they do exist. If you have some, you know, secret records or some leaks, it's of course would be cool to keep them in encrypted containers, such as VeraCrypt, you know, a very good app which allows you to create those encrypted containers. Of course, it's good to encrypt your hard drive with a good password. So my account was hacked, my Gmail account was hacked 5 years ago, and the technology the Russian secret services used was pretty cool, you know. What they did, and that is, you know, actually what guys from Google tell me about it, but they didn't, you know, because they don't create, you know, Gmail for, they don't think that Russians will, by that time they didn't know that Russians will be so smart. So what they do, they just, you know, I had the recovery, probably each of you have the recovery phone number at your account, so if you forget your password, they will send the recovery code to your SIM card, which is very vulnerable, because what Russian secret services did, they cloned my SIM card, switched off my SIM card, and they got the recovery code on the cloned SIM card, and that's how they were able to hack my Gmail account. But you know what? I was not very upset, because 70% of my email is encrypted with PGP. And I think that, you know, guys from FSB were very unhappy when they got, you know, the whole Gmail stuff and it was encrypted and they couldn't decrypt it, you know. So there are plenty of cybersecurity things which everybody can use, and I would probably recommend you a very cool website which somehow summarizes all of them, and it's called Security in a Box. securityinabox.probably.net. And there is a bunch of tools which we constantly, which some people constantly use, but not me.
Yeah. So we won't talk about security anymore because we shouldn't. So. Turning to Zanik. So freedom of the press doesn't just mean having the freedom to hold government accountable. It's also about being able to hold the powerful accountable. Sometimes that means companies like Walmart. You and David at the New York Times, you won the Pulitzer for your story on how Walmart used bribery. I read that you filed more than 800 Freedom of Information requests and spent years working on that story. How do you even begin to tackle such a mammoth story and to navigate its complex angles?
Well, I had the fortune to have David Barstow as the head of the team, so that's how. But I think it's, I think what was very unique about the project is that the Freedom of Information law in Mexico, which now gives us access to documents and records in the hands of the government was pretty new when we started the project. I mean, it had been around for probably 8 years. And you have had FOIA for so much longer. So what we had is, the team, we had David Barstow's expertise in using the Freedom of Information Act in the US with all its twists and turns. He knew like the shortcuts. He knew more about how bureaucracy thought and what they were thinking when they were when we asked them questions. He knew what it meant for a bureaucrat to be asked, to be confronted with that decision of giving or retaining information from a reporter. And on the other hand, we had my ingenuity, which was also good, and turned out. And also we had a law that turned out to be even better than the US FOIA law. The Mexican law basically sets deadlines that no one in the US has. You can wait for 6 months for a FOIA, for an answer in the US, and you have 20 working days in Mexico. So I think what we did is my knowledge of the Mexican bureaucracy and the way of thought, and David's expertise with FOIA and how this obligation to deliver records makes a bureaucracy work. Helped us a lot into understanding and making a strategy into how to find the very hidden, well-hidden proof that there had been corruption in Mexico.
Okay, thank you. So picking up that thread, Venkatesh, so I'm going to throw out an acronym, and you can tell us what it means. What is RTI, and how does that help journalists in India in their work?
RTI is a landmark legislation that was passed in the early 2000s, and it stands for Right to Information, which is pretty similar to the Freedom of Information and the act you were describing. And in India, it's 30 working days, which is also pretty good. And the thing is, it was passed about 15, 16 years ago, and it led to the formation of RTI activists across the country. And in fact, if there is any community that is in more danger than journalists, it's the RTI activists who started filing these RTI requests through every level of government, local to national and state, and started getting information that was embarrassing to people who were in government. But what has happened in the last couple of years is that the new administration has sort of wised up and is making it difficult within the loopholes of the law to give information to journalists or anybody who's filing an RTI request. And so it's like there's a wave of RTI activists. They were attacked, but there's wave upon wave. But at the same time, now the current administration has stamped down on that, and then there is a sort of response to that, which is trying to get around the way the government does that. And it is still something that is taking shape as we speak.
Wow. So you focused in your work a lot on training journalists and workshops and that sort of thing. Is that one of the things you're trying to help journalists do to navigate this Byzantine landscape?
Increasingly, I just want to recall what Joel was saying in the previous panel, which is that it is no longer possible for a journalist or an RTI activist or a couple of journalists to have the kind of impact that they desire through a series of stories. It's more important for them to work in collaboration with other journalists, whether the other journalists are in the same organization or across organizations. So increasingly my work is focused on fostering this kind of collaboration. And in the last 4 to 5 months, for example, I've put together a coalition of newsrooms in India to gear up for the big election, the national election that's going to happen in 2019. And the idea is to sort of focus on disinformation, misinformation, other forms of information that is manipulated. And I'm happy to report that at this stage, a lot of organizations are enthusiastic about this.
That's great to hear. Let's take an example from Botswana. Joel has worked on several notable projects, including the Panama Papers, as we've mentioned. But another notable investigation involved uncovering how government funds were being misspent to build a huge retirement complex for the president. Despite you know, the government in Botswana is mired in secrecy, and of course they didn't want that story told. How did you uncover it?
Maybe just briefly, let me also explain that out of the 54 African countries, only 18 have laws that promote access to information. And as you mentioned earlier, Ghana and South Africa are top up there. So Botswana doesn't have a law that promotes access to information that you call FOIA here. Mm-hmm. So what happens is that the public tends to trust the journalists so much that they believe when there is something going on, only the media can, especially private journalists, can really deal with their problems. So President Khama, his name is Khama, he retired in April this year. Ahead of his retirement, he was using the military to construct for himself, using taxpayers' money, an airstrip worth $6 million in the bush, in the middle of the country. Botswana has got vast tourism, and he was just on the edge of sort of a delta where there's a lot of tourism, and almost a villa or a mini, really paradise for himself. So the army was concerned that they are being made to do stuff for corruption, really. So we set out 600 miles to the place, and the long and short of the story is that when we were just about 5 miles, we got arrested by plainclothes officers who apparently happened to know what we were up to in the bush, and they stopped us and told us, where you are going, you are not supposed to go. They didn't even ask us where we are going. They told us it is not place to go there. They then interrogated us, I think, for 2 hours, but we managed during the interrogation to call one of the lawyers who is feared, and they got to know that we did that, and it really kind of balanced the scales in terms of the conversations in the bush, and they were carrying guns, driving expensive SUVs. So what they did finally was that they asked us to go back to the city, or wherever we came from. So what was striking is that we went to the nearest police station to report, because it was intimidation. Because what they did was, they said, before they returned, they asked us to return, they said, you, Joel, and your colleague, who we are managing, the co-managing partner, no matter what happens in future, we are asking you to return, but in future, don't ever think of setting your foot here. Ooh. If you do, we will shoot you and kill you. And this is an officer of law with a gun that is owned by the state, and he's telling you that he will kill you. And at the time, my daughter was 3 months, and I told him, I have a child. He said, yeah, but you understand through the barrel of a gun, so what we will do is we will kill you, you will never see the child. So it was scary. We had to go to police station. And the officer was surprised that we actually mustered the courage to go to try to do a story of that nature. He said, what are you doing there? You guys, you are also, because this is the nature in Africa whereby presidents shouldn't be questioned up to a certain level because they are elders. So you should not be questioning elders. So we kind of gave up and went back to the city. But 2 months later, we engaged a US company called Digital Globe to get actually the satellite image of that compound, because we did not get there, we didn't take the pictures. So the story became bigger because we managed now to have a bird's eye view of the residence, which showed now the length of the airstrip, the extent of the project, the military trucks and the Bowsers busy at work. And the state did not like that. 2 months later, there was a serious break in our office. First, there was a visit by plainclothes officers saying they are just paying a visit, not very clear what they want. 2 days later, there was a break-in, which we reported, and normally dies down, and they are still investigating up to now.
Wow.
So this is the nature of things that are very normal in Botswana.
Well, thank you for sharing. My next question is for Roman. You've heard the Panama Papers mentioned several times. Roman, of course, worked on the Panama Papers. He worked on the subsequent project, the Paradise Papers. His work over a 5-year period revealed the disappearance of $1 billion from Russia's budget that ended up in offshore accounts and shell companies throughout Europe. So Roman, in a country such as Russia, how do you even begin to get the records, to follow the money, to track down such a story?
Well, first of all, part of this billion appeared in the US. They used 20 million to buy properties on Manhattan. So, some of the dirty money, goes to this as well. And there was a civil forfeiture case started after that investigation, and which ended up just recently. Believe it or not, Russia is very open in public records. So we've got company records, we've got court records, and actually some of the databases are even better than here in the US, because I constantly use Pacer, and sometimes I spend half of my salary on, on getting all those records from the American, database, of course. So if people from Pacer, are watching this video, guys, do something, because, we gotta lose all our money in Russia, just to read your records. Well, in Russia, and still, you just can search by the party name. Well, in Russia, you can search by any keyword. So our we're very good. We're very good at open records. What they try to do sometimes, when there was a series of investigations against secret services, and after which I was hacked, what they tried to do, they tried to close the property register, but then they suddenly realized that if they do that, the number of frauds in the real estate, it will just it will go high. And they invented something smarter, as they think. So they started deleting the names of the officials from the records. So you say you can go somewhere at the Moscow region, you will see a very big, house, and if you want to check who is the owner of the house, you'll get just, the line saying that there is a physical person owning the house, I don't know what they do with Vladimir Putin, maybe they say, metaphysical person owning the house, or, But those properties which belong to officials or their relatives, they just delete the names. But records are still available, and we are very open in this sense. 70% of stories I do come actually from open records.
Okay, thank you very much. So at this time, we're going to turn to questions from the audience. So. Okay, so one of the first questions we'll go to Alejandra Tezanik. You've worked with many news organizations, but as an independent journalist, a freelancer, why be independent? Does it make your job easier or more difficult?
Well, I thought when I started being an independent journalist, what I thought is that first I was very shy. I was too shy to look for an actual job. I moved to the capital city and I was totally panicked with big newsrooms. And but it really what made me an independent journalist is the idea that I could probably make more in-depth investigation on my own than what I could do in a media organization where there's basically no room for investigation. So that was the reason that took me. And what happened is that in the end, I actually did more of the work I didn't want to do just to pay the rent, but I was able to subside my own investigations and bring some sense to my room for my passion. But what I found right now is that you have, I think I started being a freelancer when nobody was a freelancer, and officials in Mexico, you would say you're an independent journalist, and we would go like, independent from what? It's like, but now you have lots and lots of independent journalists, and I think that what the leitmotif there is that they're all wanting to open space for investigative pieces or for stories that are not finding their way through the mainstream media, as happens in Botswana, and from what I hear in India too. The big issue in Mexico, apart from organized crime, is the lack of independent media. We don't have business women and businessmen in the media who have interesting or have innovated or have explored new avenues to sustain their business other than government advertising. And that has really cut the freedom of speech very, very harshly. There are zones of silence in Mexico where things are just not published because the owners of the media, either because the drug cartels are too big of a threat, or because the media owners are just unwilling to let some stories go. So more and more you have a huge crowd of freelance reporters trying to get those stories out.
Okay, thank you. So our next question, and several of you may want to respond to this, but we'll start with Ramon. What about increasing threats to informants and witnesses? Are these threats making it difficult to find sources?
Yeah, that's probably the first time today when I'll try to get serious, because I mean, my main concern are people we talk to, because they are in. This is the most dangerous situation for them, since there are not so many independent media left in Russia. Some of people really risk their lives to talk to us, and that's when I talk to my reporters. That's the only topic where I really get serious, and I said that, look, this is your responsibility to save their lives, and this is your responsibility to make them feel safe. And you know what? I mean, it's not so difficult, to be honest. I mean, it is difficult, but if you follow certain rules and if you treat it seriously, none of my sources, as we do it in Russia, none of my sources has ever been exposed or faced any threats and problems because we follow the procedure. While I know examples in Russia where people just didn't how do you say it normally? Didn't care about their sources, and some of their sources were imprisoned, and I know some examples when people even were killed because they didn't care about the security. So yeah, protect sources is point one in our modus operandi in my office.
Anyone else?
Well, just want to offer a general comment, because increasingly the media in India, and I think around the world as well, is under pressure for to be more and more transparent, and it's a good thing. But the big dilemma is, what do you do with informers? What do you do with whistleblowers? And in India, there's a whistleblowing law, but it's not enough. And the question is, there is increasing pressure to name your sources, except in cases where naming sources is going to be a serious danger. So I see, from an observer perspective, I see these two movements clashing. And to increase credibility, there's this tendency in a lot of Indian news in which a reporter will say, sources say, unnamed sources say. And so I think that has been abused a lot in some cases, and in some cases there are journalists who are doing a lot of valuable work working with informers and whistleblowers, and they need to keep their identities under wraps under any circumstance. Sometimes the pressure to reveal sources ends up compromising this situation where witnesses need to be protected at all costs.
Yeah. So unfortunately, we're drawing close to the end of our time together this evening. I have one more question that I'll throw open to the panel. We've heard about physical dangers, we've heard about legal threats. How do you maintain hope as a journalist in the face of all that you endure? What keeps you going?
Yeah, if I may start, you tend to know that what you're doing is good, you're in public interest, and you know that if you can't do it, who else will? So, and there are young stars who look up to you, young journalists, and you need to do things right so that they develop the confidence to do things right as well. So, to me, that is the biggest motivation.
Thank you.
So I became a journalist in 2006, 12 years ago, and I was really an idealist, right? So I believe that journalism can really change at least my country for the better. So it's gone like a long time ago. I don't believe that we can change something for better, and I'm not kidding. I'm cynical. Being cynical today in Russia is saving your time, right? So I'm cynical in this sense. Simultaneously, if people don't need it, then they just don't need it. What keeps me doing this job? Just one thing, I love it. So I really love the process. I love the process of finding the story. I love the process of publishing the story. I love the process of writing. So I just love my job, and that's what keeps me going on and continuing, the job.
Well, I'm an optimist by nature, but I have to agree with Roman there that I'm quite skeptical now, and the reason for that is, there's so much information. There's information overload that's coming from all directions for your average citizen, that it's very, very difficult to find the journalism that not just informs but also educates. And for those reasons, because of a combination of technology and WhatsApp is a major source of happiness in India, but it's also a major source of problems. And so I see problems for journalism multiplying, but at the same time, what gets me going is that happy confluence of what am I good at doing, what I like doing, and what frankly gets me paid to do. So I'll keep going.
Zanek, any closing comments?
Well, I guess what keeps me going is I have the feeling that in Mexico we have a big debt with the public, with the audience. I think we've fed them with very, very lousy work for many, many years. The media in Mexico were for many years like the loudspeakers for the powerful. It was just quotes and quotes and quotes and quotes, no end. And so I think I do believe in the public service of journalism, and I do think we are in very big debt. And I do hope that we can engage readers and audiences if we just go to a shift to another way of doing journalism. And I'm seeing more and more of that, and that's what has me very excited.
Thank you. We'll have to leave it there. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panel.
So thank you all for being here tonight. I'd like to thank all the panelists from both panels. Let's just give them one more round of applause. Next Tuesday, it's Power to the People, holding the powerful accountable. And we're going to be talking about, we have some people who are the managing director of the Panama Papers. We're going to get more deeply into that, as well as Trump's truth checker from the Toronto Star, and we're going to be talking about holding the powerful accountable around the world and in DC. And I think you'll find some hopeful notes in that presentation. Thank you very much, and we'll see you tomorrow night, or Tuesday night.